Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. This is Paramita and I welcome you to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to visit my page, go through the content, and if you really find my lectures helpful, then do like it, share it, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And please remember that you should always turn on the notification button so that you do not miss any update. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the lecture.
The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde. In this PowerPoint presentation, we shall discuss the themes as well as the symbols in the short story The Happy Prince. Let us first have a look at the several themes that are very much there in the short story. So, the first theme is love and compassion for others. Now, if we try to analyze this first theme, we find that the entire story focuses on the compassion of a beautiful statue, who is the happy prince, and the loyalty of a common bird, which is the swallow. But neither of them is aware of the suffering and pain of the common townspeople until they witness it from the palace wall. The happy prince who has always led a carefree life while he was alive, he feels pity for the common people and he begins to weep for them. Because when he was inside the palace walls, he didn't have any idea about what was happening, to the people in the town and how they led a life of misery as they struggled hard to provide uh, for their families. And when we look at the character of the swallow, we find that even the swallow, becomes compassionate in the company of the happy prince, and he also becomes loyal to him. And what he does, the swallow, he simply uses the jewels and gold, which decorate the statue to help many people in the town. While when we look at the rich people, the elite class, we find that they are completely unaware. They are completely, in fact, they don't even bother about the poor people. They lack that compassion. They don't even think of helping the townspeople. So, if you look at the story, the time when it was written, it was between 1820 and 1914, which was the late Victorian period. And it was a time, when society was largely class based because it was during Queen Victoria's rule in Britain. And the social scenario was undergoing change because more lower class people were able to work outside their homes and help, improve the standard of their families. So we find that as the industrial revolution, it began, it led to more education, career development because the middle class also arose. They began to educate themselves for their own advancement. And if you look at Oscar Wilde, he himself was a product of the booming middle class society. Okay, so uh, he what he did in his life when he wrote this story, his sons were very young, and so he always taught his sons that it is better to live a life with high morals, okay, instead of being a superior to other people. Being rich, it's better to be morally superior, and one should always have compassion for others instead of simply, ignoring them or neglecting them who are in need of dire help. The next theme that I'll talk about is beauty and morality. So, what do we find in the text in this short story, Beauty and Morality? What do we find? That the main character in the short story is the happy prince. Okay, and his statue is meant to decorate the city. But this happy prince, he demonstrates the darker sides of society's obsession with beauty, while the extreme poverty and social inequality was very very much prevalent then for the and he turns to let's say as far as the happy prince is concerned, when we read the initial part of the story, we find that it focuses on external beauty. Why? Because the statue is decorated with gold and sapphires and red ruby. So which means that all these descriptions, they focus on outer beauty. And then we find that although the prince is called happy, but he is not happy. Instead, he weeps. When the swallow first meets him, he finds him that he is weeping. So, when the prince lived in the palace, he did not have any idea about the suffering of the townspeople. But later on, he realized after his death that it is all about this beauty. If it is all about beauty, then we can relate beauty to deception and even cruel indifference. Why? Because he realized that how the rich people are completely indifferent towards the miseries, towards the suffering of the poor people. And not only that, he finds that beauty is actually built on the backs of poor townspeople, which hides their suffering. This is what he uh, realizes. And after that, we find that happiness, like what can give you happiness? An important aspect or an important theme of this story is happiness, that it is only through compassion, it is only through love and compassion for others that we can have or we can gain actual happiness in life. The happiness that we receive or the pleasure that we receive from material things, it's not what we call or consider actual happiness. The next theme is selfishness of the upper class society, that how these people they were completely uh, desperate to maintain their social position as the upper class in society, and they did not even care about the poor people for the lower part of society, and they never even thought like how they survived. So it is not until after the happy prince dies and he witnesses the suffering from the column that he begins to feel for the downtrodden. He begins to weep for them, and therefore he convinces Swallow to help him, because he feels that urge within to change the lives of those people who are suffering miserably. And he says that now we can relate this to happiness as well, to the theme of happiness as well, because according to the prince, we can have you know actual happiness in life only if we are able to make others happy. And therefore, he realizes that his life has been a meaningless one, because when he was alive, he couldn't help others, he couldn't help these miserable people to be happy. So now he is very much eager to bring about a change in their miserable life, which is shown by Oscar Wilde in the story. And during that time period, it was not at all normal for upper class people. The next topic or the next theme that I'll discuss is poverty, inequality, and greed. Now, that is very much there in the story. We come across characters who are in an impoverished state. Then we come across characters, you know, uh, which shows that how society maintains this uh, or distinguishes between rich and poor, and how it is the greed, how the responsible citizens, like, let's say, I won't say the responsible citizens, but how, the high ranked people in society who are supposed to take care of the welfare of the community, who are responsible for the welfare of the community, simply feed their own material greed, simply feed their own interest, selfish interests, and how this leads to, inequality in society. And it is because of their shrewdness, it is because of their selfishness that other people, you know they are made to live a miserable life. And sacrifice. Sacrifice is also because swallow, as well as the happy prince. If you look at the relationship that is shared between the happy prince and swallow, what does the swallow do finally? Sacrifices his life. Okay, but although he dies, he sacrifices, but he achieves true happiness in life. The last theme is religion, where we find that since Oscar Wilde himself was a Christian, in fact, he was a dedicated Christian all his life, and so religious themes pervade his short stories. And here in The Happy Prince, there are religious themes because the way the statue of the Happy Prince is depicted, it represents a Christ like figure. And just like, Jesus Christ in the Bible, the happy prince is also shown, that he is also shown that how he decides to sacrifice himself to alleviate the sufferings of the poor people. And finally, how God rewards him in paradise. So ultimately, the religious influences in the story teach us to value making sacrifices, that we should sacrifice for those who are oppressed by poverty, who live an impoverished life, and who cannot stand for themselves. So as far as the story is concerned, it clearly draws, thematic parallels to biblical teachings, and that is entirely centered on the Christ-like central figure, which implies the figure of the protagonist, the happy prince. So, although Oscar Wilde, he talks about Christian moral teachings in the story, and shows its loyalty, to Christianity, but at the same time he depicts other religions in the town, depicting them containing, stereotypes like then. So, finally, what we can say, or to conclude the theme religion, we can say that while Oscar Wilde, presents before readers Christian teachings of compassion, sacrifice, martyrdom, okay, and how one should care for the oppressed, but at the same time, he also, depicts some hypocrisy in the story itself, that sometimes religion remains, continues to remain stereotype. Now we shall discuss the significance of the several symbols in the short story. So the first symbol that I'm going to analyze is the lead heart. So if we look at the prince's lead heart, it symbolizes immortality on one hand, and on the other hand it also symbolizes, the firm nature of love, because in the beginning it is shown that the prince has a heart made of lead, but when swallow dies of the cold, it breaks. So at first, his laden heart was simply, you know, uh, simply it served as uh, as a, as an artificial aspect of his beauty, which decorated the prince's statue from outside. Okay, but later on we find that although this lead is very ugly, okay, but it does not prevent from engendering compassion and goodness, which the happy prince is capable of. So, although later on, we find that the officials, the high-ranked officials of the town, they melt the heart, okay, and repurpose it with the rest of the statue. But we find that the heart refuses to melt. And at the end, we find that God asks for the two most precious things that should be brought in the city uh, to him. One is the lead heart, which, despite being broken, is one of those precious, becomes one of those two precious things. So we can say that this lead heart actually uh, keeps or lends immortality to the happy prince, number one. Secondly, it also symbolizes the firmness of true love as well as the value of compassion. The next, the next symbol is children. Oscar Wilde often, uses children in his short stories as a symbol of innocence and goodness. And here too, in this short story, The Happy Prince, we find him doing the same. On various occasions, we find in the story that how children, okay, they make observations, or they are able to observe their own suffering, but then they get rebuked by an adult. Just as the match girl who gets, bitten by her father, and the mathematical master also resents, the children, charity children whom he should teach. Okay, so what Oscar Wilde aims at is that he tries to bring children in his short story in order to symbolize their innocence, in order to represent how innocent they are, which stands in stark contrast to the corruption existing in society, which shows that children are always innocent and they are not born evil. So evil is never born. Okay, we teach people. It is this society which teaches us to be evil, and we learn to be evil, but we are never born evil. And another point that Wilde tries to show that these children, they are innocent, so they are not supposed to undergo so much of suffering in their life, the but it is the social situation that they are forced to suffer, which exposes that how toxic our civilization is. So the next symbol that I'm going to discuss is Egypt. Now, the Happy Prince, in the story, Happy Prince, the story is set in a European city. Okay, and Egypt here symbolizes the swallow's desire, to live for himself and to live a life of pleasure. Egypt actually, it does not exist as a place for the swallow, but it is for him, a series, it represents, but for him, Egypt represents a series of artistic, aesthetic images which lend him which lent pure pleasure to him. And here in the story, we find how the swallow describes Egypt using rich imagery, which stands in stark contrast again to the cold and dirtiness that he observes in the European city. Apart from this, we can say that the way the Egypt also kind of represents escape from one's local context and the possibility of perpetuating in ignorance, meaning how you can escape from your local, the place where you belong to, and then the possibility how you can continue to live, without paying any attention to your surrounding, without paying any attention to the misery that is around you. The next symbol is swallow. So if we look at it, is a very important symbol because the swallow here represents or symbolizes loyalty. Because since the very beginning of the story, we find that although he wants to go to Egypt, but every time the swallow is requested by the happy prince, he listens to him, abides by what he says, and refuses to leave for Egypt with the others. And finally, we find how he decides, to stay with the happy prince because he learns from the happy prince the value of compassion and as well as the value of sacrifice. The last or the final symbol is the townspeople. So what do they represent, these townspeople? So on one hand, we can say that these townspeople, especially the councillors, okay, they symbolize repression. But here, considering the townspeople as a whole, if we look at the poor people, they represent poverty, they represent misery. While if we look at the high-ranked people in society, the councillors and all, the politicians, we find that they symbolize repression. Because later on, what happened, what we find is that they wanted to get rid of the statue. Why? Because it looked dull, it appeared dull, and it was no longer beautiful, and they wanted to use the metal to make a statue of the mayor instead, which also shows, that how outer appearance or external appearance matters to them more than inner goodness. So these people are not only greedy, these people are not only corrupted, but at the same time, they have much affinity for external beauty, and they are not bothered to pay attention to anybody's inner goodness. Thank you.